Welcome, Allen Ruff. I'd like to really thank you for coming on the show to talk about today's hot topic. On September 12th, 2021, what's on my mind is the 20th anniversary of September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and the aftermath up to and including our recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. I've invited you because you, as an activist and historian, speak on topics in such depth and with such clarity and such a informed perspective, and you're willing to go where many humans fear to tread, which we need more than ever. And so I'd love for you to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself to show why I wanted to invite you here.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. I'm a U.S. historian and a longtime observer of the impact of U.S. involvement and interventions in what is sometimes referred to as the Greater Middle East. That's a catch-all. Sometimes people include everything from Morocco on the Atlantic north coast of Africa all the way to Pakistan, across the entire band. I was one of the initial members of the Madison Area Peace Coalition, which formed during the run-up to the invasion of Afghanistan that took place in the first week of October of 2001, less than a month after September 11th. So that's who I am. I've long been an activist around international issues, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. empire, and so on. No,
thank you.
Sure.
So I know it's a brief amount of time, but could you give us a bit of a synopsis of your perspective on 9/11 and how it relates to a variety of U.S. interventions? Take it away.
Well, as I said then on September 11th, 2001, and the days after, and as I continue to say, the events of that day, September 11th, 2001, did not fall from the sky. They didn't come out of the blue. The imperial policies and interventions of successive U.S. administrations, extending all the way back to the 1940s, set the stage for what became this forever war for the greater Middle East that many of us are familiar with. Neither September 11th nor the recent developments in Afghanistan and elsewhere can truly be understood without that longer context. Look, the United States came out of World War II the lone superpower, a nuclear-armed superpower, and it had goals for the Middle East that were enunciated during the war and immediately in several years afterwards. And those goals were several. One, to gain and maintain control of the region's oil in Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and elsewhere. Number two, initially, to supplant declining British and French colonialism in the region. A third would be to offset and neutralize post-war secular, and this is very important for the bigger story, to offset and neutralize post-war secular and nationalist movements for self-determination and independence, especially movements of the left, but also, more importantly, in actuality, Arab and pan-Arab nationalism, Nasserism in Egypt, the Baathists in Iraq and Syria, and the nationalist movement in oil-rich Iran. Ultimately, too, a fourth primary goal, which is often placed first, depending on who you listen to, who you read, was to exclude any competitors or adversaries from the region. In the Cold War context, of course, that meant the Soviet Union. The overall espoused goal was to ensure stability in the region under US aegis, under US control power. The irony, of course, is that the US presence, its interventionism and penetration of the region ensured instability, right? I mean, there's some like Henry Kissinger, for instance, who talked about the stability of instability. Right? I'm going to run through some pivotal moments in that history. Absolutely fundamental for an understanding of everything that came after was what happened in Iran in 1953. The CIA engineered overthrow of the freely elected secular nationalist Mohammad Mossadegh, who did what? He committed a cardinal sin. He talked about nationalizing Iran's oil, taking it out of the hands of then British control. Not only was not only was Mossadegh deposed, but the United States brought back the Shah of Iran. And that led to a swirling history that I'll refer to again. We're talking about the post-Vietnam era, where the US was reluctant, because of political pressure at home, reluctant to introduce troops, ground troops, anywhere in the world. It was called the Vietnam Syndrome. That led to the creation in the Middle East of what came to be known as a regional gendarme system, regional policemen doing the work of the American Empire. It was also referred to as initially as the Twin Pillars strategy, that Iran and Saudi Arabia would be the bulwarks against Soviet influence and cornerstone of US-defined regional stability and security in the region. They would also be the countervailing force against any Arab nationalism, independence movements, and so on. That regional gendarme system was later joined by others, most notably Israel and Turkey, as well as the oil emirates in the Gulf. I mentioned some pivotal moments. 1979, we'll jump quickly, shorthand some history here. 1979 was a pivotal year. In January 1979, the Shah of Iran was ousted by the Iranian Revolution. That was a major, major strategic loss for the United States. Importantly, it was not a victory by the secular left, but by the Islamic-led mass movement headed by, of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And that's key, right? It was a turning point in the history for the region. So that's January of 79. Almost a full year later, November of 79, we witnessed the beginning of the Iran hostage crisis, as Iranian students demanding the return of the criminal Shah, who was given refuge in the United States, took over the US embassy in Tehran. A month later, in December of 79, the Soviet military intervention in Afghanistan took place. A country then, first off, one of the most impoverished countries in the world at that time, then destabilized in part by growing infighting between various communist factions in Kabul, and worsened by Islamic Mujahideen insurgency, right? Already being aided by the United States. And I want to come back to that because that's so essential to our story. I'll come back to that. That Soviet military intervention led to what was the beginning of the 10-year-long Soviet-Afghan War, in which the US, in alliance with the Saudis and Pakistan, massively aided the coalition of anti-Soviet resistance groups, again, generically known as the Mujahideen. It was probably 20 different groupings. That force was supplemented by international volunteers, aided by Saudi money and US intelligence, international volunteers known as the jihadi from across the Muslim world, commonly referred to as the Arabs. Among them was a young engineer from a prominent Saudi family named Osama bin Laden. That war devastated the already impoverished country. In most of the country, by that time, there was no running water, even in the cities. Electricity, roads were rutted. The Soviet air war bombed the hell out of the country, and there was incredible heavy fighting. So what was the result of these pivotal moments in 1979? Here in the States, we received the Carter Doctrine, enunciated by President Jimmy Carter, and people forget about this, right? This, post-presidential man of peace, right? That the Carter Doctrine of January 26, 1980, delivered during a State of the Union message that year, was the first, enunciated the first formal commitment of US military power in the region. And I'll just a quick quote to the bottom of it. Jimmy Carter, in his doctrine, promulgated by the foreign policy war hawk, his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said that any attempt by a foreign power to gain control of the Persian Gulf and surrounding area would be regarded as an attack on the vital interests of the USA and would be stopped by all means necessary, including the use of military force. Again, announced in January of 80, 14 years before the formation of the Taliban, and well more than 21 years before 9/11. Another pivotal moment, pivotal development came with the Iraq-Iran war, which began on the 22nd of September, 1980. Iraq attacks Iran, backed, we later learned, by the US, by Ronald Reagan, and financially assisted by the conservative Arab primary Sunni Gulf regimes. And that was an 8-year bloodletting that led to, some estimate, as many as 2 million casualties. So what was the result of that war? It led eventually to the first Gulf War, direct US involvement on the ground starting in August of 90. Iraq, excuse me, that Iraq invasion of Kuwait, which was the first Gulf War, was green-lighted by the US, and it ultimately led to the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait. But in the run-up to that war, the US landed the bulk of its ground troops in Saudi Arabia, Iraq's southern neighbor. The presence of that force on Saudi soil, seen as a heathen army presence in the land of Islam's holiest sites, allowed by the corrupt regime in Riyadh, was one factor which gave impetus to the militant Islamist movement known as Al-Qaeda, led, of course, by bin Laden. I want to come back to Afghanistan. Keep in mind that the Iran-Iraq War and the subsequent Gulf War paralleled successive conflicts in Afghanistan. Following the 1989 withdrawal of the Soviets, defeated after 10 years, the various factions of the US-backed insurgency soon took to fighting with each other in what became a devastating 8-year civil war that leveled most of Kabul and pounded the rest of the country. That civil war among the former US-backed allies, see, here we go, the stability of instability. The civil war among the former US-backed allies led to the formation of the Taliban and Pashtun language meaning students, young men who were trained in the madrasas, the schools in Pakistan, who became fed up with the infighting and corruption among the major Mujahideen factions aided by the US, right? This Mujahideen, which Reagan and his people referred to as the valiant rebel freedom fighters, right? The Taliban formalized in September of 1994 in a meeting of, if you think about this, a meeting of 20 people, right? In Kandahar, of 20 young Orthodox reformers headed by the Mullah Muhammad Omar. They took power 2 years later in Kabul in 1996. Now, many of you, I assume, should be somewhat familiar with the events of September 11th and what they bred. Less than a month after the tragedies that day, the US invaded Afghanistan on October 7th and remained there for just under 20 years. Deposed but never fully defeated, the Taliban took refuge in the mountainous regions of the porous Afghanistan borderlands, from which they carried on low-level insurgency or rebuilt their support and bided their time. And that brings us, in my estimation, to the present moment.
What could have happened had we had a different response? But what now? Yeah, what's your take on our withdrawal and where we're headed now with our policies in the region?
Well, first off, we have to remember that the Taliban, as the US geared up for that invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban leadership offered to basically hand over Osama bin Laden and some of his key people. But George Bush, too, had a list of ultimatums, non-negotiable, which could not have been fulfilled. Again, if it was a criminal act that propelled the US moves in the region at that point, then here's those held accountable. Bring them to an international court, bring them to the United States, and so on. But again, it was the assertion of US power in the region that took precedence.
And especially right now when we're declassifying documents about Saudi involvement, particularly, how it's been an open demand that we remove our military from holy sites and Saudi territory. I'm wondering if you have a perspective on what we expect to learn from declassified documents and what you expect the outcome to be of that.
There's so much that's already out there in the public record. Very, very informative are the official documents that weren't classified, right? Of the State Department, the foreign policy record, and so on. Iran still is a central part of this story, right? And that conflict runs mostly cold under the surface, back and forth, but that doesn't go away. One of the grievances of Osama bin Laden articulated, and many others, is the role of Israel in the region. And without some resolution to the Palestinian question, there cannot be peace in the region. I mean, I think it's very interesting that one of the key motivations in the Soviet move into Afghanistan in 1979, aside from an attempt to bolster their allies in Kabul, was their concern about the spread of the Islamic Revolution to what was then still the underbelly, largely Muslim, of the former Soviet Union. And that still percolates in the sense that things are not resolved on the ground in those old Muslim republics. I mean, what else is there? And now, of course, China, I've been reading the past couple of days, China will deal with the Taliban, right? And Uh, and that's feared in Washington, certainly, in ruling circles in Washington. China's becoming the ascending global power. The thing that's most signified by this defeat, this withdrawal, this retreat of U.S. empire in Afghanistan is the fact that it is a descending hegemon, a descending superpower. Still very powerful, strongest military in the world still, and so on. But the times there are changing. Backward or forward, I can't say.
Yes. Something a friend of mine said not too long after, well, probably a few years after September 11th, 2001, was just reminding us that it was a choice to respond to that with war and divisiveness. And I do like to imagine what would have happened if we had responded with active peacemaking, with the amount that we, or that our governments and corporate state have poured into active war making, and maybe imagine that for the future.
Yeah.
So
now the other thing, of course, that we haven't touched on at all was the domestic U.S. impact of the war years. First, the attack on Afghanistan, then the Iraq War, and so on. The war on terror, which became known as the GWAT, the General War, the Global War on Terror, which meant at home as well. The ramming through of the Patriot Act, the increase of budgets and technologies for surveillance, which the vast majority of the Democrats at the time went along with, and so on. And that still continues to percolate. There are still people that were rounded up in Afghanistan in the early days of that invasion in October 20th of 2001 that are still in Guantanamo, right? Untried, without any due process, and in a sense that holding of captives is domestic and foreign, national and international. And that, of course, impacts on our democratic processes, impacts on our society. And of course, going in along those same lines is the militarization of our culture. Right, everything from the massive Pentagon paid for patriotic displays at collective support, mass sporting events, to a film culture, a TV culture that sells war as solution, and so on. And it comes right down here to a local level here in Madison, Wisconsin. That is the ongoing move to place, 20 F-35 advanced fighter jets at Truax Field here in Madison, supported by who? By Democrat Tammy Baldwin, good senator that people adore, and so on. I must say that for years after the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, that for years we had a magnet on our refrigerator, placed there by my wife. It was there for years, saying she redid a Tammy Baldwin for Senate sticker, put it on a magnet, but it said Tammy Baldwin voted for war.
yes.
Right.
Thank you. We don't have time to talk about it during the interview, but I'm going to play some music about it later. I think we need to stop believing that Democrats aren't warmongers until they give us some evidence. There has not been much in my lifetime, and I've seen Democratic administrations and Democratic personalities get a pass on some of the most horrific things, including drone strikes on 16-year-old American citizens, et cetera, because of them being Democrats, and that needs to end. So are there any parting thoughts you can give us that give us a bit of hope or a message? I have one after hearing you. There's so much symbolism in the twin pillars of the policy with Iran and Saudi Arabia, and there's just so much, and there's so much that we're going to learn over time, and so much importance to knowing more of our history so we can be informed and we can talk. I mean, the divisiveness and the militarization of the police force and all these things, like the militarization of our culture and the surveillance state, are coming right down to a very personal level that we've seen at other points in history. And I think it's really essential to resist it. And is there anything that you can share for the last minute of our time together that tells us what direction you would like us to go?
You know, my mentor at the UW History Department, the late great Harvey Goldberg, who educated generations of us about this foreign policy part of which I just laid out, used to say that the popular memory, unfortunately, is 15 minutes long. That there's a systematic erasure of history from our culture. A culture that is presentist and looking toward the future and the past. Folks have to study the history, have to dig it out. There's a massive, wonderful literature that's many of us too few of us are acquainted with, and that it's a weapon, a positive weapon, a weapon for peace, for justice, for truth, to counter the propaganda passed off as patriotic history, patriotic knowledge that leads us only into further involvements, interventions, wars, and suffering abroad. So I, of course, want to thank you, Stephanie, and maybe we'll do something else sometime.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much for your role in helping us learn our history and for doing that here today. Take care.
Thank you.